Hello everybody, nice to see you this morning. Today my name is Tanya and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about something that I'm really interested in, which are different kinds of insects and invertebrates. So I've been really lucky. Since I was really young, I used to run around catching different insects and playing with them and bringing them home in jars. And when I got a little bit older, I went to university, and because of that, I'm now able to get paid to do a job that I love, which is great. So I now get paid to play with insects all day. So really good, really fun for me. I want you all to just have a minute and think about what your favorite animal is in your head. Just take a second and think, what is your favorite animal, the animal that you absolutely love? I'll just give you a second to think about it. Okay? Now, how many of you said, for example, dogs? Is that anybody's favorite animal dog? A couple of you. Yeah. How about cats? Yep. Do any of you have animals that are on that picture? So cats or dogs or wombats, horses, hedgehogs, rabbits. Yeah. Siberian tigers even. So usually when I ask that question, most of the answers I get are things that are furry. So animals like dogs or cats and things like that. And nobody ever says invertebrates. Now, did any of you say any of the animals on this picture, like spiders or worms or mantises or any kind of insect? Yeah, almost nobody ever says one of these things. And I think that's a pity because these animals are really, really interesting. So I hope that by the end of this little talk, you'll agree with me that these are really interesting creatures. Now, scientists divide animals up into two groups. Things that we call vertebrates, which are all the things on this slide. So animals that have spines and backbones, and they're usually pretty furry. Those are vertebrates, and weird vertebrates too. And all the other animals are called invertebrates. So these are things like insects that don't have backbones and that have their skeletons either on the outside or that don't have skeletons at all. And these are the animals that I study. So often when I go out to parties or to meet people, I say, oh yeah, I'm an entomologist, I study insects. And people go, oh, that's really interesting. I have this big insect problem in my house. There's lots of cockroaches. Can you fix it? And I go, that's not really what I do. I'm not that kind of a scientist. I don't study how to kill insects. I study how they behave, and I like watching them do things. And people go, why? Why would you ever study invertebrates? That just sounds weird. And I think that's a very silly question because invertebrates are awesome. So I'm going to show you two of my favorite animals right now, and I hope that after this you'll agree with me that invertebrates are kind of awesome. This animal here is called a velvet worm. It's this big furry creature. Let's see if I can get this video. Here we go.
Es uno de los invertebrados más antiguos que existen y su estilo de giro es único.
Volume down. So this is a velvet worm, and what it's doing is it's crawling around, and you can see it's got lots of different legs. But look at that. When it gets hungry, it shoots glue from nozzles under the bottom of its face. So watch again, you can see it's looking, shooting glue. So that's pretty cool. So when a velvet worm is hungry, it crawls around, looks for food, then shoots glue from nozzles that are under the side of its body, and that lands on the food, and the food kind of gets stuck like it's in cement, and then it can't move anymore, and the velvet worm will then crawl up and eat it. Now, that's like being Spider-Man, except that it's this invertebrate creature. Now, you might think that something as weird as a velvet worm is only found maybe on tropical islands somewhere far out in the ocean, but that's not true at all. Velvet worms are actually really, really common. So if you go up to places like the Blue Mountains, or really anywhere that there's a forest, you can actually see velvet worms. They're living inside rotting wood. Now, how many of you have ever actually seen a velvet worm? Anybody? Anyone? Oh, you have? Well done. That's cool. They're very hard to see, so good on you for actually having been able to observe one. They're very difficult to see, but they actually are very common. So if you ever get a chance, have a look, because they're really, really neat. The other animal I want to tell you about is probably right now my favorite animal. It's called a mantis shrimp. And it looks kind of like a gigantic lobster with funny little arms. And one of the most interesting things about the mantis shrimp is that it has these big googly eyes on top of its head. And when scientists first saw those big googly eyes, they wondered, well, what do they do? What's the point of them? And it turns out that mantis shrimp actually have some of the best vision in the animal kingdom. So before I tell you why they're really good, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how eyes see color. Now, to be able to see color, you need to have special cells in your eye that are sensitive to particular parts of the color spectrum. So in a human eye, we have 3 different kinds of light-sensitive cell, one that can see blue, one that sees green, and one that sees red. And so all the rainbow of colors that you can see come about because of those 3 different types of cells and all the mixtures of those 3 different colors. So humans have pretty good color vision. It's much better than a dog has. Dogs have 2 kinds of light-sensitive cell, so they can see a bit of blue, a bit of green, and a tiny bit of yellow, but not much else. Butterflies, though, have 5 different kinds of light-sensitive cell, so they can see 2 extra colors that we humans have no name for. Well, how many do you think that the mantis shrimp can see? It's got these strange googly eyes. Well, the answer is 16. So they can see 16 different colors, most of which humans have no name for. So they can see 13 extra colors, plus all the mixtures of all of those colors together. So what must the world look like to a mantis shrimp? It must just be this crazy super rainbow of color. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And scientists don't know why. We don't really understand why the mantis shrimp has such good vision. We just know that it can see many, many, many more colors than any other animal that we know of. The second really cool thing about a mantis shrimp is that it's got these funny little arms, just like a praying mantis does. And it uses them to catch its food. So this is a picture of a hungry mantis shrimp jumping out of its burrow, and it's shot out its arms there, and it's grabbed a fish, and it's going to now start eating the fish. So it's got these really scary arms. Now, that's not that interesting because lots of animals have that way of eating, like praying mantises. What's amazing about the mantis shrimp is that it can move those arms faster than a bullet leaves a rifle. That's how fast a mantis shrimp can extend those arms. It's so fast that if you could move your arm as fast as a mantis shrimp could, you would be able to throw a ball from Earth into space. That's how fast your arm would be able to move. It's really amazing. It's so fast that the water in front of the mantis shrimp's arms begins to boil. So it starts boiling because it gets really hot, and it makes a flash of light. So even if it doesn't actually hit its food, it can actually shoot like a death ray at the food to actually go and kill it. So these things are amazing hunters that can see amazing color, but almost nobody knows anything about them. So again, we have this really interesting animal that people don't really study enough. So there's lots of opportunities to learn new things about animals around us. So I still haven't really answered the question I started off with, though, which is why should we study invertebrates? And one of the big reasons, I think, is because they can teach us a lot about how to design a more sustainable, better planet. So, for example, one of the main ways we waste energy in our houses is through heating and cooling. So on really hot days, we turn the air conditioning way up, which uses a lot of energy. On really cold days, we turn the heating up, which also uses a lot of energy. So one way that we can conserve energy, which is really important, would be to build our houses so that they don't need air conditioning or heating. And it turns out that termites already know how to do this. So these animals that you can see on the screen are termites. The smaller little white ones are workers, and that big scary looking one with the gigantic abdomen is the queen termite. And all of that big white abdomen on her back is full of eggs. So a queen termite can lay several million eggs every single day, and she can live to be about 30 years old. So that's a lot of eggs that she can put out throughout her lifetime. Now, termites live in these beautiful mounds. Some of them can be really, really tall. So if you can see there's one in the corner there, you can see a car parked next to it. And the termite mound goes several meters up into the sky. So they're really, really big and really cool looking things. And in many of the environments where termites live, the temperature can get really, really hot, so up to 40 degrees in the daytime, but then it can also go down to about 0 degrees at night. So it goes really hot in the day and very, very cold at night. But when scientists put thermometers inside of the termite nest, what they found was that the temperature inside the nest stayed the same all the time. So even though it was really hot outside, it was still cool in the nest. And when it was really cool outside, it was still a nice warm temperature in the nest. And so the question is, how do termites do this? Because they don't have air conditioning like we do. They don't have heating systems like we do. And what scientists found when they actually cut into the nests was that the nests have tons of these really thin tunnels that cut through them. And that tunnel system functions like a kind of air conditioning. So it sucks warm air in during the cool parts of the day. And when it gets too hot outside, it pushes hot air out and draws cool air in. So the termites have invented their very own kind of air conditioning. And what's amazing about this kind of air conditioning is that it doesn't need any extra energy. So obviously they're not connected to the power grid. They can't get any energy. It's a passive form of air conditioning. So one thing we could do is to build our buildings like termite mounds. Now, I'm pretty sure none of you want to actually live inside of a termite mound. It's a pretty sandy place, not really a good place for people. But what we can do is take what we've learned from termite mounds and use that to build our buildings. So for example, this is a shopping center in Zimbabwe that was built to look like a termite mound. So inside of the building, there are all sorts of tunnels that function just like the ones I showed you in the termite mounds. They push hot air out when it's hot, and they suck cold air in. And because of that system, this building doesn't need any air conditioning or any heating, even though it's in a place where it gets very hot in the daytime and very cold at night. There's another building like this in Melbourne now that's pretty new. And just like the one in Zimbabwe, it doesn't really need very much air conditioning or very much heating because it's built to resemble and to mimic what the termites are able to do. So if we study the kinds of houses that insects and other invertebrates live in, we might be able to learn interesting new ways to make our houses even better. The second problem that insects can help us to solve is how to use less petrol, because we're all probably using too much petrol right now, and that causes a lot of air pollution, which isn't very good. So how many of you have ever been lost in a car, say with your mom or your dad or someone else driving you around? How many people have ever been lost? Yeah, most of you have probably been lost, yeah. Even when I was coming here today, I got lost in the car and spent 10 minutes sort of driving around in circles. Now think about how much extra petrol we're using when we get lost and we're just driving around. That's a lot of petrol. Now think about how much that would be over each of our entire lifetimes, and then multiply that by everybody in the world who's driving a car and getting lost. And then you think about people who drive for a living, like people who are driving cars or people who are delivering things in cars. That's a lot of petrol that's wasted. So if we can find ways of getting from where we want to go, or from where we are to where we want to go, in the best, shortest way possible, that would really help conserve petrol. And so how many of you guys have GPS units in your cars? Those little things that say, yep, most of you guys, yeah, cool. GPSs are great. They help us find the best way to get to where we want to go. Now, inside of a GPS unit, there's a program called an algorithm, and that algorithm tells the GPS how to find the shortest point between where you started and where you want to go. The problem is that those algorithms don't always work very well, so they don't always find the shortest way. So what scientists are trying to do is to find an algorithm that works better, that helps us find the shortest way to connect a bunch of points. And you might not think that insects can help with that, but actually they can. So one of the projects that I work on in the lab is trying to find out how ants can help us build better GPS systems. Now, some species of ants have lots of nests, and they connect those lots of nests with these little trails. I'm sure you've seen ant trails, where they kind of squiggle around and they connect everything up. Now, it's kind of like having a city connecting with all these little roads, ant roads, connecting all the different nests. So one of the experiments I did was to try to find out whether ants can find the shortest way to connect different points. So I used two different shapes. One's a triangle, so you can see there's a nest on each of the corners of the triangle, and one is a square, so the nests are in each of the corners of the square. So what I want you guys is to take a second and think about if you were to connect those nests up using the shortest amount of trail, how would you do it? What is the shortest way to do it? So I'll give you just a second to think about that. And then I'll tell you the answer, and we'll see how well you did. All right, ready? So did anybody come up with that? A shape that looked like that? Because that is the second best way to connect those points. It's not the shortest, but it's the second shortest. The actual shortest is something that looks like that. So if you were to connect those nests using the shortest amount of trail, that is what you would do. Now, don't feel bad if you got the wrong answer. It's a really, really difficult thing to solve. And even when I ask students in my university classes to do it, most of them can't solve it in their head. So don't feel bad if you didn't get it right. So what I did is I made the ants, I put them inside the lab and put nests in those shapes and then looked at the kinds of trails they made. And so I hope you can see this well enough. Those sort of gray lines are ant trails. So I'll put a little black over them so you can see them a little bit more clearly. And the red dots are the points on the nest. And so what the ants have done is they've actually connected their nests using the shortest possible amount of trail. And those words, the minimal spanning tree and Steiner minimal tree, are just fancy math terms for what those shapes are actually called. So for the square, same thing. The ants have found either the shortest possible way or the second shortest way to connect those points up. And when you think about it, an ant's brain is smaller than the period at the end of a sentence. It's really, really tiny. And individually, they're not very clever. If you take one ant out of its colony, it just kind of walks in circles looking sad and confused. It doesn't really do anything. But if you put hundreds of thousands of ants together, they can solve these difficult problems that even university students can't solve. And so this is something we call swarm intelligence. So it's the ability of very silly or not very smart individuals, if you put them together in a team, they're able to do very clever things. And this is really important because it's basically the way computer programs work. And so if we can figure out the rules that ants use to solve these problems, we can make our GPS systems even better. And that's actually started to happen. Many GPSs are now using an algorithm that came from the ants. So by studying the ants, we've been able to make our GPSs better and hopefully save petrol and make our world a little bit more efficient place. One thing I want to point out, though, is that Australia has 1,500 different kinds of ants. This is probably the best place on Earth if you want to study ants. And we know almost nothing about the vast majority of them. So it's really important for us to get out there, start looking at the ants, because they may have solutions to other problems. And we'll only find out if we study their behavior in a little bit more detail. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea of the kinds of things that entomologists do. So we're not all just running around trying to solve pest problems in people's houses. We do a lot of stuff like studying behavior. And I just want to let you know that you don't need to wait to become an entomologist. I started studying insects when I was very, very young, and you don't need any special equipment. It's nice to have a butterfly net so you can catch things, but you don't really need one. A magnifying glass is helpful so you can get up close to insects, but again, you don't really need one. And one of the wonderful things about studying insects is you don't need to go anywhere special. So in my career, I've been really lucky to travel all around the world. I've been to Canada and the United States. I've been to Japan and Sweden and Denmark and South Africa, all around the world studying insects. And that's one of the great things about going to university, is that it opens up this whole world of travel that you're allowed to do. So it's really great. But you don't actually need to go to those places to study insects, because insects are everywhere. I'm sure that on your way to school this morning, you probably passed hundreds of insects, and some of those insects will be species that scientists have never seen before, because most of the insects in Australia haven't been named yet, which is kind of hard to believe. And they're all over the place. So even if you live in the inner city, so where there's, say, very few trees around, there will be heaps of insects. If you go to a playground, there will be heaps of insects. Even in your schoolyard, I'm sure there are lots of different kinds of insects. For example, one of the projects I'm working on this summer is to look at bees. Now, when you think of bees, I bet you most of you are thinking of yellow and black stripy guys that fly around and then sting people and hang out in flowers. But that's only one kind of bee. It's called a European honeybee because it was actually brought to Australia from Europe. It's not a native species. In Sydney, there are actually 300 kinds of bee, just in Sydney. And these are all sorts of bees, like the blue and black striped blue-banded bees. There are big green carpenter bees, little yellow and black masked bees, heaps and heaps of different species. So even if you never leave Sydney, there are hundreds of different bees you could work with, and we don't know anything about the behavior of most of them. So all you really need to do is get outside and start looking at insects, and you could discover something new. If you like beetles, there are 1,500 different kinds of beetle species in Australia alone. In Sydney alone, so that's a whole lot. And then in Australia, there are 30,000 different species. So that's a lot of different kinds of beetles just in Australia. So one of the special tools that you need to have if you're a entomologist is the ability to see things that might be hiding. So you need to look very closely. So for example, this is a picture of a flower, and waiting to catch food is a crab spider. So you can see it's got its arms like this, and what it's waiting for is for a bee to fly by, and then it'll grab it and eat it. So you have to look very closely. Here it gives another example. That's a crab spider, and you can see he's got a bee, but you can just barely see the spider hiding in the flower. So you have to learn to look really closely. This might just look like some sticks, but in fact, there's two stick insects in this picture. One's sort of big and long, and the other one's a bit smaller and getting a piggyback ride from the bigger one. So if you look really closely, you'd be surprised at all the things that you can see. This is interesting because it's easy to see, and it looks like an ant, but if you look really closely and you count the number of legs, you'll notice it actually has 8 legs. That's too many legs to be an insect. This is actually a spider pretending to be an ant. So it pretends to be an ant until something comes by, and then it grabs it and eats it. So you just need to learn to look really closely. Now, someone has asked, what is the most popular ant that lives in Australia? That's a really good question. There are lots of different kinds. Popular, I'd probably say meat ants. I love meat ants myself, so I'm a little bit biased. But meat ants are really common. They make these really big mounds, and they're covered in ants. And one of the neat things about meat ants is that, as you might know, there are lots of cane toads, particularly up in northern parts of Australia. And cane toads are an invasive species that were brought in a long time ago and have caused lots and lots of problems. But meat ants are actually able to eat cane toads. So it's like a natural form of defense for our ecosystems. We have these wonderful native ants that can actually stop invasive species. So they're really, really cool creatures. So I hope that, at the end of this talk, you like insects and other invertebrates a little bit more. And even if you don't love them, I'm hoping that you'll be nicer to them. So if you find a spider or a cockroach or something in your house, you don't need to squish it. Just pick it up, take it outside, and let it go on its way. Because not only are these things, living creatures that are really interesting, but they might help us save the world someday. So, and you can help do that by just, protecting them and by making observations about any invertebrates you happen to see. So thank you very much for listening, guys. It's been great talking to you. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. A queen ant with a wasp. Ooh, it's not going to end very well for the queen ant. So ants are really good at fighting when they're in big groups. But a queen ant, first of all, she's really big. She can't really run very far. She's got very tiny little jaws. And because she's by herself, she can't really fight. Wasps have stingers, and they're very, very good at stinging and eating things. So I think the wasp would almost definitely be able to beat the queen ant, which is a bit sad for the queen ant, really. Okay, my favorite spider, that's hard. I've got 2. Can I answer with 2? Okay. My first favorite spider are these guys, the jumping spiders. They're just really cute. They've got giant eyes. They don't make webs, so they just kind of crawl around looking for things to eat. And then they jump on them and kill them. So they're scary hunters, but they've got these really, really cute faces. So they're probably my favorite. There's a kind of jumping spider that's called a peacock spider because it's got this big blue display it makes, which is really cool. My second kind of favorite spider is called an ogre spider. And what ogre spiders do, they're all over Sydney, so you may have seen one. They sit there waiting for their prey, and they make a net out of silk. And when their prey comes by, they throw the net on the prey, which is really, really cool to see, and not very many spiders do that. My favorite kind of beetle, that's hard. I guess my favorite beetle is probably one you don't know about. It's called a mountain pine beetle. It's really, really tiny, and I love it because that's the beetle that I studied when I first went to university. So I spent 4 years in forests, hiking around, doing lots of bushwalking, and looking at this one kind of beetle. So they're kind of special to me because of that. Yes, a butterfly is an insect. If you're ever not sure if something's an insect, count the number of legs, because insects will always have 6. Oh, that's hard. I think my favorite butterfly is probably a monarch butterfly, and that's because they can migrate all across the world. So in the springtime, monarch butterflies up in North America, so places like Canada, will actually fly all the way down to Mexico. So that's thousands and thousands of kilometers of flying by these tiny little butterflies. And when they get there, if you have a chance later on, if you Google monarch butterflies in Mexico, beautiful pictures of just millions of monarchs on trees that they've migrated down to. So those are probably my favorites. Oh, it would be very bad. So ant species don't get along. Even ants from different nests of the same species don't get along. So as soon as you take two and put them together, they will fight, and they'll probably fight to the death. They're very, very territorial, and they don't like being placed in other ants' nests. My favorite insect, okay. I don't know if I can answer that because I like so many different kinds. I love praying mantises. They're very cool because they've got the, shooty bits. I love cockroaches, especially giant cockroaches. At home right now, I have a kind of giant cockroach that's as big as my hand. And they're really great. They burrow in the ground and they move very slowly. They're pretty interesting. I like stick insects too. Oh, there's just too many. I could be here for hours talking about my favorite insects. Why do tarantulas have blue blood? Uh-oh, I'm not sure I can answer that. A lot of different... So the reason your blood is red is because it has a protein in it called hemoglobin, and that allows oxygen to be absorbed by your blood and moved through its body. Other types of animals use a different kind of protein. So in things like tarantulas and I think horseshoe crabs, they use something called hemocyanin, and it's the same. It does the same job. It's just that it's a blue protein that's in the blood, and that's why their blood ends up being blue. Ooh, okay. The most dangerous insect in the world is probably honeybees. But that's just because a lot of people have an allergy to them. So there aren't really any insects that are going to come after you and attack you. Most insects would prefer just to be left alone. But some people do have allergies to honeybees, and honeybees are pretty much everywhere. So if you have that really serious kind of allergies, honeybees can be bad. Although, now that I think about it, I'm changing my answer because the most dangerous insect in the world would be a mosquito. And that's because mosquitoes carry a lot of diseases. So it's not so much a problem in places like Australia, but in some countries, mosquitoes can carry things like malaria and dengue fever and a lot of really nasty diseases. So, in fact, mosquitoes are probably the most dangerous animal of any kind in the world, even more so than things like tigers and lions and bears. Mosquitoes are probably more dangerous. A fire ant's called a fire ant because when you get bitten by one, it feels like you're on fire. They have a terrible, terrible bite. And it's actually more than just a bite. So they'll bite you with their jaws, but they also reach back and sting you with a stinger they have on their abdomens. And they inject a little bit of venom into you as well. And so that causes it to blister, just like you've been burned. So if you get hundreds of thousands of them on you, it's really bad and it feels like you're on fire, which is why they're called fire ants. Okay. I'd probably have to say Japan. In Japan, I saw some really gigantic beetles, and they would just be running around in the forest. So you'd just be doing a little bushwalk, and there would be these gigantic beetles. And in Japan, people often keep insects as pets as well. So you can be walking down the street, and people will be selling beetles and cockroaches and really interesting stick insects, kind of the same way you go to a pet store and buy like a cat or a dog. So that was probably my favorite. Although I have to say the best country on earth that I've ever been to for insects is right here. It's Australia. It's wonderful insects here. Oh, that's a good one. So humans, when we need to take in air, we do it through our mouths and our noses. Insects don't do that. They have little holes along the sides of their bodies, and those holes are called spiracles. And they use that to take air inside. Now, they don't have lungs. What they have instead are these really thin tubes that kind of go throughout their body. So the air gets sucked into the holes on their sides, and then it gets distributed through their bodies in these little tiny tubes. So it's a completely different way of breathing than what humans and other animals do. these are great questions. That one is hard. I'm not sure I know the answer. Most species of insect that come out all at one time of year, it's just because that's how their life cycle is set up. So they spend most of their time as little larvae, little grubs living in the ground. And then when the temperature gets warm enough, which is just around Christmas here, they all come up. They all mate, and then they lay their eggs, and then they all die. And then the eggs go back into the ground, and it takes them another year to be big enough to come back out. So they're waiting for I think the ground to get to the right temperature before they know that they need to come out as adults. I don't really remember. I have loved insects since I was really small. So I used to run around and catch things around my house when I was little. My poor mother was always like, there's too many insects in the house. So I think it was a bit hard for her. But I think for a long time I wanted to study. I wasn't sure which animal I wanted to study. I loved insects, but I wasn't really sure if you could have a career, if you could get money from making insects or from studying insects. And then when I got to university, it's really nice because you're allowed to study pretty much anything you're interested in. So I took lots of courses in insects and invertebrate biology, and the more I learned about them, the more interested I got. And that kind of taught me that you can actually have a career studying insects. So I'd say that I've always been interested in insects since I was little, but it wasn't until university that I realized that I could turn that love into a real job that I now love a lot. I don't know. That's the short answer. Insects just have so many different kinds of life cycles. So some of them, like termite queens, can live for 30 years, and some don't live very long. The ones that don't live very long usually don't have mouths, and they don't have stomachs. So they don't eat at all while they're alive, which means they really can't live for very long. But those kinds of insects, although they only live for one day as an adult, they're probably babies for a lot longer. So things like mayflies, which come out only for a couple of days, as winged adults, they spend several months as larvae living in water. So just because the adult only lives for a day doesn't mean that the whole life cycle is a day. Okay, there are two really deadly spiders. The most deadly, I think, is the Brazilian wandering spider, and that's found in Brazil and has probably the strongest venom. But the second most deadly one is found right here in Sydney. It's the Sydney funnel web spider, and they're also very, very strong venom. But remember that all of these spiders don't really want to come after you, so as long as you leave them alone, they'll be happy to leave you alone too. That's only something they'll do as a form of self-defense. It is. It depends on the kind of cicada, so there's many different species. Some live underground for 7 years. There's even some that live underground for 16 or 17 years. And then they come out and they only live for a few weeks before they die. So they can live anywhere from 1 year to 7 years to 17 years, depending on the kind of cicada. Wow, that is an excellent question. It's because diseases are usually very, very specific to the thing that they are trying to infect. So something like malaria isn't trying to infect a mosquito. It's trying to live in a human. And it's basically just using the mosquito like a way of getting transported. So because a virus can't, or a parasite in that case, can't move around on its own, it gets into the mosquito, uses the mosquito to transport it to nice, yummy humans, and then once it's in the humans, that's where it starts to replicate and starts to cause problems. But the mosquitoes aren't really being infected by it. They're kind of just a way of they're being used like cars almost to move the malaria and other things around. Healthier? Depends what you mean. Do you mean healthier to eat? They're probably not that healthy to eat because they're so small. But insects in general are actually very high in protein and very low in fat. So if you want to have a healthy diet, eating insects is actually a good way to go. Although I don't know whether fruit flies are any healthier than any other kind. Oh, probably ants. So if you're talking about the number of insects around, ants, in terms of the number of individuals, it's estimated there are roughly 10. So imagine the number 10 and then put 16 zeros after it. That is the number of individual ants that are on the planet. That is a lot of ants. But that's only if you're counting the number of individuals. If we're talking about the number of species, then hands down the answer is beetles. Beetles are actually the most common type of any living thing on the planet. So about a quarter of all living things, so including plants and fungi and animals, a quarter of them are actually beetles. So it's estimated that there are about 30,000 species of beetle just in Australia. So if we're talking about number of species, the most common insect are beetles. But if we're talking about number of individuals, then it's probably ants. No, you know what? I haven't really. Most of the kinds of things, I'm more interested in studying their behavior. So I don't really spend so much time looking for new species. Although sometimes it just happens. So a friend of mine who works in the same office that I do, she was studying the behavior of stingless bees. And while she was watching a stingless bee, something started to crawl out of its head, like that. And it turned out it was a parasite, a kind of parasitic wasp that nobody had ever seen before. And so she was the first person to discover that kind of wasp, even though she wasn't really looking for it. The camel spider, they're funny because they're actually not deadly at all. So I'd give them maybe a 0.5, maybe a 1. They're big, but they're actually not as big as the pictures you tend to see on the internet, which makes them look as if they're, gigantic things. So they're not that dangerous at all. And I don't know if anybody's ever actually even been killed or even really hurt by a camel spider. So they're scarier than they look. Well, the other way around, sorry, they look scarier than they are. No, so when it's in the ground, that shell is basically what it looks like. So it's got those sort of hook-shaped legs. But then what you're seeing is when it comes out of the ground, it splits open, and then a new thing comes out. So the new thing looks quite different than the shell. It's got wings and big googly eyes, and it's kind of green. So you have two different forms of a Socata. The baby, which looks like the shell, and the adult, which looks completely different. Well, it's because not all tarantulas are poisonous. So some species have venom, but most of them don't. So I've actually held tarantulas lots of times, and they're kind of cute. They just crawl around on your hand, and they won't bite you. And even if they did bite you, they don't have very strong venom. So when we say the word tarantula, it's actually talking about lots and lots of different kinds of big hairy spider. Some of them have venom, but a lot of them don't. So people who have pet tarantulas are usually keeping the kind that don't have any venom. Oh, that's tricky. Depends what you mean when you talk about a brain. So in humans, all of our nervous system is pretty much, well, the big part of it is all concentrated in our heads, and we call that a brain. In insects, they have a lot of neurons up here called a brain, but they also have little tiny bundles of neurons that we call ganglia, and those are all over their body. So I don't know about mosquitoes specifically, but something like a cockroach has one big brain up here, but then it has a whole bunch of ganglia, these little mini brains throughout its body. And those mini brains can do things without the main brain knowing it. So have you ever turned on a light and you notice how cockroaches pretty much zoom as soon as the light's on? It's super, super fast. Well, that's because on the termite's legs there are a kind of cell that can sense light. So when the leg sees light, it sends a message to the little mini brain kind of in the thorax, in the middle of the cockroach, and that tells the legs to start running. And they start running before the message even reaches the main brain. So insects are kind of funny because they've got this main brain, but they also have these ganglia, which are kind of like mini brains. And I imagine a mosquito is probably the same, but I'm not sure about mosquito specifically. I don't know. I don't think so. So usually in most countries, insects, because they're not vertebrates, there aren't really very many rules about keeping them. So as far as I know, there aren't, but you should probably check before you get too many of them. But I mean, at my house, for example, I've got a giant cockroach and some stick insects that you have. So I don't think you actually need a license. I think you would need a license if you wanted to keep anything that was dangerous. But, you shouldn't be keeping anything that's too dangerous anyway. So for just common insects, I don't think so. Two different colored eyes. Oh, I'm not sure. I can't think of any that have different colored eyes. The thing about insects is they've got two big main eyes, but they also have a whole bunch of very small simple eyes as well. So, for example, there's one kind of bee I've been studying which has big red eyes, so two big red eyes, but then it also has three very small black simple eyes that just can see light and dark. So I guess they're different colors, but I'm not sure about any that have different colored compound eyes. Oh, okay. I don't know. Queen termites, like I said, can live 20 or 30 years, and I think they're probably the oldest that I can think of. Yeah, queen honeybees only live 4 or 5 years, so probably not them. There are some species of stingless bee that can also live about 10 years, so it's probably the queen termite, I think. I'm not sure. You have to go like that to find out. Not very much at all. I mean, they're not very big creatures, so it's probably maybe, I don't know, a drop of blood. Not much more than that. Well, great. Thank you very much, guys. It was nice talking to you, and like I said, I hope that you now like insects a little bit more than you did before, and if not, just please don't kill them, because I really like them. So thanks, guys. Bye.